Is anybody in a fearful mood tonight? Yeah? Anybody? Okay. So if you know the theme, the topic of this evening, as we send it out usually on Wednesdays as a reminder, and in case you don't get these reminders, just let Golda Malka at the door know and she'll put you on the list. So the topic is freeing yourself from fear. And following the axiom and the principle that I always begin with at this class, which is, in one word, relevance. Personal and spiritual relevance of biblical or other timeless themes. So, if one looks at the Torah as a blueprint for life, rather than just an ancient text. So a blueprint for life implies that it has to cover the entire spectrum of life. And the entire spectrum of life goes from one extreme to the next. There are the joys we experience, and there are the pains we experience. There are the confidence and courageous moments in our lives, and then there are our fears and anxieties and insecurities. Maybe it would be a blessing if we had a half-half, but for most people, especially once you've begun to acknowledge some of the driving forces inside of you, sadly, it's often the negative, the insecure, the fears that shape so much of our decisions, so many of our decisions. So if Torah is the blueprint for life, it has to address not only the pleasant moments, but also the darker moments. And one of the fascinating things, or maybe the best kept secret, that you don't learn in the Hebrew school, or in yeshivas even, and I can tell you because I went to them, is the personal relevance and even indispensable relevance of the themes that we read about week after week. And you have to wonder, if you read the Bible, whatever version you're reading, whether it's the Hebrew or it's different English translations, much of it, I mean, there are definitely classical stories that still capture the imagination of people today, and even the imagination of Hollywood. The classic stories of the Garden of Eden, Paradise Lost, stories like Exodus, other particular episodes that touch our hearts and souls. But the predominant quantity of biblical reading doesn't seem to have anything to do with modern life, contemporary life. There's an entire book of Leviticus, the third book, that is all about laws that are absolutely obscure. At this point, many of them are not even practical because there's no holy temple. Laws of offerings, the sacrifices, laws of purity and impurity. And this rest is also with other books in the Bible. It all seems antiquated, meaning ancient and irrelevant to our time. And therefore the question is, why should we even talk about it? Which is one of the big dichotomies that exists today, that you have so-called more observant or Orthodox Jews who are committed to every letter of the word in the Torah, and will read the readings of the Torah every Shabbos in the synagogue, every letter being pronounced a particular way. And if it's not read properly, you have the whole, witch hunt committee that makes sure to remind the Baal Korah, the reader, that there's a mistake. It's almost like, it's like a life and death thing in some synagogues. And you have gabbais, and you have all kinds of things. Whenever I am involved in the service, I remember Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur here, sometimes it looks like a conspiracy going on up there when they read the Torah. All these guys standing there, one side, the other side, and you always have two people on both sides of the bima and all that. So I speak as both as an insider, as an outsider. I guess I have that unique perspective, because it could also be somewhat a little almost comical. But it could also be tragic, because if there's so much precision and so much obsession with the details, and then if someone says, well, so why do we really care about these readings and these chapters and the stories and so on? So if it's someone who's a real devout rabbi will raise their hands in like anguish, how could you even ask such sacrilegious, irreverent questions? And then, so you don't get an answer there. So then you have the other denominations along the spectrum of Jewish life. And there's plenty of them. For every Jew there's another denomination almost. Each with their own version of how we're supposed to really identify with the Bible or with the Torah. Not here to go through all the different opinions, but I could speak to you from my own heart as a natural skeptic, even though I grew up with this devout connection, and I went to yeshiva and we pored over every letter and every verse in the Torah thousands of times, with all the commentaries and the counter-commentaries and arguments, both on the Bible and then the commentaries on the commentaries. It's generations of discussions. And then the biggest question that you always ask is, who cares? Who cares about all these different nuances? So obviously, if you believe that it's the Word of God, so then divine Word, we analyze and analyze yet again, and continuously try to delve into, they say, hafachba, v'hafachba, the kulaba. You turn it and you turn it because everything is in it. And it's true. You do find layers and layers and layers of fascinating and profound and dense ideas and concepts which have shaped the modern world as well. Constitutional law, people aren't even aware of how much of constitutional law of the United States, for example, or for most democratic systems, is based on biblical law and Talmudic law. Even how contracts are written, how every I is dotted and T's are crossed, the thoroughness, the analysis, it's really, the Talmud is essentially a fascinating template of legal analysis, of legal application that covers every scenario possible. So it's a time-tested method. But that's more on you can say, legal and practical and mechanical side of it. The big challenge is, as I said, the relevance to our personal lives. That has in some way been lost to this generation, maybe to a few, and therefore you have the big cutoff. As I said, the schism between people who are very devout and committed to the letter of the law, and then we ask how refined are they as a result of it, and where do you find answers to our lives' issues and problems. Most people will go to therapy for that, or will go to read a psychology book. Very few, I don't know anybody actually, that will have a problem with their spouse, or with their children, or just dealing with their own psychological demons, will open up a chumash to look for solace or direction. Maybe they'll escape into a chumash, but I don't know if they'll look into it for advice or guidance. And that's what always plagued me, because it seemed to me that if the Torah was not providing the answers to the most fundamental questions we struggle with, why did it last for so many years? It's impossible to imagine that intelligent Jews were committed to a book that didn't speak to their hearts and souls. It couldn't have just been a mechanical guide of how to slaughter a chicken or to know when the sun goes down. What about the personal application? Jews have a profound people. When they lasted through the most difficult circumstances like no nation, they had to have some deeper spiritual resilience and insight to life than just the message of the superficial message that appears on the surface level when you read the Torah. And that's when I came to realize that this best kept secret, as I was saying, is that there's another part of the Torah called the soul. The soul, just like every body needs a soul to be alive, and without it it's a corpse, the same is true with the Torah. That if you only read the body of the Torah, the mechanics, you will have maybe a complex and very powerful system, but it won't be alive, and it won't be passionate, and it won't be relevant to our personal issues. And then you discover lines that come from the great mystics who are universally accepted by all scholars, like a person like the Shalah, for instance. Isaac Yitzchak Horowitz was one of the great medieval, middle-age, 16th century scholars in the Talmud and in mysticism, and writes a line that he quotes from previous Kabbalists before him, that it's not, people think the Torah speaks about things down here and alludes to things up there, when in truth the Torah speaks about things up there and alludes to things down here. Which means technically that the Torah is really a spiritual book that speaks in the language of man, as opposed to being a physical book that alludes to spiritual ideas. And then when you begin to think of it that way, then life itself takes on a whole different shape. Who are we as human beings? Are we physical human beings having from time to time spiritual experiences? Or are we spiritual creatures traveling on a physical journey? So I'm sure each of us wonders, probably has two opinions about this. I mean, two voices inside of us. It depends what mood you're in. But it seems to resonate more that our soul, however you define that your inner transcendental cravings are the more driving force that makes you tick, and the physical reality of eating and sleeping and surviving is more the mechanical and the technical part. But the fact is, 95%, if not more, of our lives we're consumed with the material. We have to make ends meet, pay our bills. So in a way, we ourselves have wandered away from our own essence. And that's how most people will identify themselves when push comes to shove. It's not necessarily a criticism, it's the realities of life. Perhaps in our younger years, when we did not have the obligations and responsibilities to pay our own bills, maybe we had more time to explore that dimension, hopefully. But definitely, once you're thrown into the rat race, it's not that simple. So we try to come together here maybe Wednesday night, and on weekends, and different ways we escape into some type of, let's call it, more transcendental place. But it's not the norm and it's not the regular. We all will go back into that world. So of course, I can talk volumes about this journey that each of us has, and we all struggle with it. But to bring it back to what I was saying, this was like somewhat of a background introduction, it comes down to that one word, relevance. And that is that if the Torah is indeed a blueprint for life, and a spiritual blueprint that has to address every aspect of life, even the most uncomfortable, and even the most obscure, and the areas that perhaps we don't even want to go to. So yes, these chapters that we're reading right now are actually the section that does address the darker aspects of life. So if you strip it away from as I said, as the Shalah says, it talks about things up there and alludes to things down here. If we stripped it away from what it alludes to, from words like Egypt and exile, and what time in history it took place, if you stripped it away and got to the core of the message and the core of the story, it's really the story of human suffering, the story of human injustice, and the story, where's God in all of this? And how do we deal with a difficult life? That's really what the story is about. If you want to connect it to the words, so as you know, you probably heard here more than once, the word Mitzrayim in Hebrew means not just Egypt. That's a technical name. Mitzrayim comes from a root that means constraints. The word Mitzrayim in Hebrew comes from the root Meitzar. Meitzar is a boundary, a limit, a constraint. It refers to all the constraints and inhibitions and fears and anything that makes us feel trapped in our lives. And above all, on a spiritual and psychological level. Now, just in case some of you are skeptical where this comes from, is this some type of modern psychobabble trying to force itself into the Torah? I'll just make the case for the scholars in the room here. And that is, the Talmud says, and this is cited very often, that b'chol dar v'dar, in every generation, a person is supposed to imagine as if they just left Egypt. B'chol dar v'dar chai v'adam liras es atzmei kilu hu yotza miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person is responsible to see himself or herself as if he just left Egypt. And some add not only b'chol dor v'dor, but b'chol yom v'yom, not only in every generation, but in every day. Which is why we mention at the end of the morning prayers, the 6 remembrances, you mention remembering the exodus from Egypt. And countless times through the prayers, every daily prayers, and different mitzvahs we do, constant reference to this exodus and journey out of Egypt. Which begs the question, what does this mean? The Jewish people left Egypt thousands of years ago. Exactly 3,315 years ago, if you're counting. Or 14 years, something like that. 2448. And most people today have not been to Egypt. Maybe some of you have traveled there, but not every day and not every generation necessarily. So what does the Talmud mean that we have? Why should we be obsessed with an event that happened so long ago and have to constantly recreate and re-envision ourselves as if we're leaving this land? That makes no sense on any practical level. Okay, so you'd have to say, well, it means that metaphorically, it's a concept, it's just to remember that our parents left. But that's not the meaning of the verse. Now, think of it now, as the Shalah puts it in the spiritual sense, it makes complete sense. Replace the word Mitzrayim with inhibitions and limits. And essentially, the exodus of Egypt was not an event that took place once in history alone. It's an event that's supposed to be happening every second of our lives. It's called in one word, transcendence. That we are all trapped in our own mates, in our own constraint, our own limited places, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And the obligation is to continuously figure out ways to free ourselves from that place. It's essentially what the human spirit is always doing anyway. We're looking to get out of this place, so to speak. To get free from the tentacles of material life and its monotony, or as Thoreau put it, a life of quiet desperation, and feel some type of freedom. And this manifests, so to speak, this exodus manifests in millions of ways in our lives. Each of you, I'm sure, can describe it in your own particular way. And it manifests not only once in your life, and every day, every time you experience another so-called Mitzrayim, you have another experience of this form. So this mitzvah, therefore, takes on a whole different meaning. It's essentially the essence of what will give us happiness if we can free ourselves some way of the inhibitions. So then the issue of fear is very much prominent in this story, because that's the first thing that happens. What happens in a person's life? Let's just go through our own. I mean, each of us have our own script and trajectory, but it all begins in a certain way. There's a certain common denominator, and that is, there's no one here that's exempt from this description. At some point, you entered into this universe, leaving your mother's womb, right? So far, so good? We all agree. From there on, it's downhill. I'm just kidding. No. But from there on, it maybe diverges. So we begin there. We leave our mother's womb. The symbolism of that is, in the mother's womb, we are all protected, nurtured, provided for, fed, and things are pretty peaceful inside that womb. We don't really remember what happened there, but we're told that you're protected there from all the turmoil and chaos and cruelty of the world outside. The Kabbalists and the mystics have their own fascinating analysis and discussion of what goes on during those 9 months, as the fetus develops and as its soul begins to get accustomed to a physical body. What takes place? Maybe we'll talk about it, if not now, some other evening. And then the child is born. And the child is born and becomes one of us. Well, you become one of us before that, but I mean, you begin to breathe the air of this toxic world. And yes, and toxic is the right word because it begins to affect us. So a newborn child is like freshly fallen snow, innocent, pure, has no agendas, has no any ill will to anyone, is completely secure, comfortable, loved and loving, hopefully. Loving for sure, but loved, hopefully. And that's a newborn child. There's no such thing as a newborn child born depressed, in need of therapy, or in any other way affected by the neurosis that human beings impose on each other. Obviously, we all have our genetic predispositions. People can be born, God forbid, with different makeups. But I mean to say the things that are man-made. That's why children are, in their innocence, are completely accepting and believe everything they're told. What you see is what you get. When's the first time any of you ever lied? It's hard to remember once you passed that threshold of maturity and seasoning. But when a child naturally does not know how to lie, the child learns how to lie from people around the child, usually the parents. And you learn to become duplicitous. So we may call it naivete, but the truth is it's seamlessness. It's a certain pure seamlessness. Now when you think about it at our age, it almost seems like either fantastical, almost unbelievable, and not realistic. Because the real world is full of duplicities, full of fragmentation. You never get, what you see is never what you get. People tell you one thing, selfishness, self-interest is the driving force in our lives. The reason I say all this is because to be able to fully understand what we are like in a world of fearlessness and full courage, you have to compare two worlds. And the fact is a child is fearless. Not because they know anything, but because they don't know anything. They don't know why they should be afraid of anything. Until they learn to be hurt. Once they're hurt, they learn that you got to protect yourself. So if you could imagine for a moment a complete utopian world of children. So it's true in The Lord of the Flies, we were exposed to another dimension, which has been analyzed as well, but there's another side to children, which is a certain utopian innocence, enchanted with the world. I'm talking about children, I mean 1 year old, where they have not yet developed politics. Because even in The Lord of the Flies, as some of the analysts point out, those are children also been jaded by an adult world. Because children on their own are not violent. It's true a child can be selfish, but you see children, they can scream and yell at each other and say, they'll never talk to you again, to their friend, and then 5 seconds later they're best friends again. With adults, we know it's not exactly that way. I remember when years ago I went to visit Israel with my family. I took my little kids to the zoo. In Ramat Gan there's a big zoo, and we went there. There's a cage, an outdoor cage with gorillas. There's 2 gorillas in this cage. So in Hebrew there's a little plaque there that talks about these gorillas, that they're in captivity now for, 26 years. I think that's what it was when we were there. And in Hebrew they said, the kufim, which is the monkeys here, the apes, was the misnalim rogez. They have, since they've been in captivity, they're carrying a grudge against each other. They're angry at each other. They don't speak to each other. And yes, lo and behold, here was the female, the male, and for 26 years they've been in this cage and they don't speak to each other. And as we were standing there, so my children in their naivete thought maybe they can reconcile and find out what each gorilla has to say, and maybe they can create find some negotiation. So while we were there, the male ape throws a twig at the female, and she grunts and gives them this dirty look. So you think it was an exception, but when you see the plaque, that's what's going on for 26 years. So just like us humans, basically, like these 2 old Jews in the old age home, who were once good friends, but now they don't speak to each other. And finally, the last days of, it's already in their 90s, someone says, "You're not going to live forever. Might as well reconcile. You were once such great buddies." She says, "No, if I speak to him, he'll think he was right." So adults have these very sophisticated tools, how we develop our friendships and carry our grudges and anger. And sadly, you see too much of it. I'm not going to go into analyzing that for now, but the fact is, however, when it comes to children, they don't have developed these sophisticated, evolved tools. So there's a certain innocence, and I call it seamlessness. There's a lack of self-consciousness a child has, which is actually its blessing. That's why a child does not have all the... Once you have self-consciousness, meaning once you're aware of yourself, that immediately implies that you are distinct from another self. And therefore their two self-interests will conflict with each other. In the simplest primitive terms, that's where all conflict comes from. When it manifests in the fullest sense, it can become war, violence, anger, and destruction. So the reason that we compare these worlds is because to really fully understand a world of, to understand fear, the only way to really the so-called defang it from its power is to understand a world where there is no fear. And the only way to really identify with that is to look into our own lives when we were in a different state, in a different stage. Now, I want to just analyze this a little further. Fear. The problem with fear is there's two types of fear. There's a fear where you're obviously an obvious situation where you're afraid of something. Say you're walking down a dark street, and you think someone's following you, God forbid. Or you encounter a wild animal. Or some other fears. These are very identifiable fears, and we have very specific symptoms, how we react. Our heart starts beating, you may run, panic, different reactions we all have. The natural reactions a person has when they're in a fearful place. That fear is more or less much easier to handle because it's very identifiable. But then there's another fear, which is much, much more complicated. It's insidious in nature, it's invisible. It's not apparent, you cannot see it. Because doesn't manifest like there's a distinct enemy or a distinct threat to your situation. It's a fear from within. It comes from childhood fears, where, just to describe a more dysfunctional home or environment, an abusive environment, where a child doesn't know where it's supposed to be, where it's going to get love from, and parents that are unpredictable for whatever reason, so a child starts beginning to be afraid of the people around the child. Whereas a child who is nurtured and loved and feels secure will build a certain self-confidence. That type of fear does not manifest itself necessarily in any physical way. It can, but it doesn't have to. That can just sit inside you and always be there with you and impact every decision you'll make the rest of your life. That's how powerful it is. The first fear, just for contrast purposes, is a fear that's in a particular situation. Once you're out of that situation, that fear is over with. Yes, it's true, some of us may have experienced a trauma in our lives, or been attacked by a dog, or been, God forbid, in a fire or a war, and that can remain with us as well. But then that's more of the second sort. That's an initial fear that then became part of our psyche, that's always there and can be reignited without any preparation, without us being even ready for it. So this second type of fear I'm describing is one that is obviously much more complicated, because you can't even point your finger to it. How many of us, for instance, have difficulty making a commitment, let's say in relationships? That's always a good one, guaranteed to work. Or other areas of our lives, and we may have all the excuses why we're not making the commitment. The wrong person, the wrong situation, blah, blah. I mean, the list goes on. It could even be good, legitimate excuses, but the root of it is not the excuses. The root of it is a fear inside of us because we're not feeling safe. And that may not even be the other person that's causing us to be that way. How can you even know? Especially for smart people, and we know how to cover our tracks well. And I don't mean that necessarily maliciously. Sometimes we cover our tracks simply we learned how to protect ourselves. So some people are excellent with justifying situations, but it's not necessarily the root of the issue. And then, of course, we always get into you have to get into the psychological model of people choosing the wrong partners in the first place because they're afraid. So they choose people they know they could always get out from, get away from. They could always have the back door. which means the whole relationship began out of fear. Not it doesn't end out of fear, it began with out of fear. So these are just examples, which I'm sure doesn't impact anybody in this room. But there are people out there, including New York City, as healthy as our relationships are in this great city, that never sleeps, that these are real issues that impact, as an example, major decisions in our lives. And I just gave a tip, I just scraped the tip of the surface of it. When you really analyze it, it can come down to almost everything you do. From what jobs you hold, how you hold a job, who you make as friends, what kind of friends you choose. Insecure people don't like to choose secure friends usually. Why is it? Because whether it's misery likes company, or you don't want to be exposed. And this again, the big problem here is not that it's being done intentionally. Most of this happens on the subconscious level, or even more unconscious level. And then we're not even aware of our own choices, but it's all driven by fears and insecurities. They say half the cure of a disease is awareness. If you knew it's coming from there, it's already a beginning. Because if you can identify the culprit and say, this comes from a deep fear inside of me that I may be abandoned, because I was abandoned as a child, and that affects every time I meet anybody, and I cannot establish trust because of that, that's the beginning of some healing. It doesn't mean it's the end of the healing, but it's the beginning. The beginning because at least you've gotten beyond the smoke screens and are at least discussing something that is real. But as we all know, that itself is a long process. So the reason I'm giving all these examples is simply because if we want to honestly talk about a topic like fear, we have to talk about it, we have to take the bull by the horns. And I guess it's a little comfortable to talk about it in this context here because we're not sitting one-on-one. So whatever I say here not necessarily mean anybody in this room. As like the Tzemach Tzedek, the great Rebbe, was once speaking at a talk he gave, a farbrengen he gave. And he said something which was, I guess, quite vulnerable. And afterwards, one of the Chassidim, one of his disciples, came to see him and said, Rebbe, why did you humiliate me in public? He said, what do you mean? Why did I humiliate? How did I humiliate you? He says, you were talking exactly about my situation. So he said, why, did I mention your name? He said, no, but everybody knows what... So the Rebbe answered him, he said, look, I'm like a hat maker, a kaplishmacher, as they say in Yiddish, a hat maker. I shape and make hats for different heads. And then I hang them up on hooks in my hat shop. And people come and fit them and see if it fits. And if it fits, they buy it. He says, and that's the one I meant. So he was saying, I make the hats. You're the one that fitted on your head. Which means he didn't really answer whether he meant him or didn't mean him. But bottom line is, you know, they say, Afghan brand the Hitler. How do you translate that? It's not so easy. That the person who's it's about is usually self-conscious about it and thinks that everybody thinks it's about that person. So since we're in a group here, you could all think about somebody near you, not you. So I think we could talk about these things a little more comfortably. Or as the other story with one of the Rebbes, a guy came to him and said, I have a friend who's ashamed to come to you. He really did something bad and he's asking for a tikkun, he's asking for a way to fix it. So the Rebbe looked at him and said, well, why did he have to expose himself to you? He could have easily come to me and say, I have a friend. You know? So, the point being that to talk about some of these sensitive subjects, it is sensitive and has to be talked about with great care. And I definitely don't want to say anything that hurts or offends anybody. But at the same time, not to talk about it, as they say, to talk is difficult, but sometimes not to talk is more difficult. Because these are issues that really are very much part of our lives, all of us. I include myself in the... At the same time, the most uncomfortable topic is to talk about one's fears and insecurities. Yeah, some people know how to talk about them, but make sure that it deflects from the real issues. Because it talks about the most vulnerable place, and that's exactly what we're afraid of. Remember, if a person is afraid of abandonment, or afraid of not being loved, or afraid of being hurt, because they were hurt once, so talking about it doesn't make them exactly excited. That's part of the fear, is the exposure, is being there. No, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, but I remember vividly one specific one when a person told me that, when I asked a guy, he went through a very difficult life, and I asked him, do you ever cry? And he said, I haven't cried in over 35 years. And it was like, it struck me. And he told me, without a tear in his eye, but I saw he was crying more than most people cry. He said to me, my father told me when I was like 6 years old, his father was abusive and alcoholic and all of that. He said, only babies cry. I never want to see you crying again. So when a child hears that, you could imagine what kind of damage that did. Because tears, the Kabbalists say tears bathe the soul. It's like a soothing force, it's salving, that it bathes your soul. But tears are also like a release. Like think of a kettle that's boiling water, and it doesn't have a spout. What will happen? At some point the kettle will explode. The spout is a release. Tears are a release. They allow you to release tension and energy. It's one way, but there are other ways as well. So when a person is forbidden to do that, one of the most cruel things, as they say, the silence can be worse than the rape. Because it's one thing the crime is perpetrated, and you can at least protest and say, I expect justice, I expect something right. But if you're silenced, and you're told you can't even cry, you can't even complain, then basically your healthy tools of even expressing anger or pain is also stripped from you. That really creates an unbelievable level of fear that's very, very difficult to counter. So these type of fears are, even though, as I said, so difficult to talk about in a certain way, but frankly, talking about it the right way, in the healthy situation, with trusting people, is critical to get beyond them. Because to bury them further just feeds right into them. Because fear likes to be concealed. It's those enemies that feed off silence, that feed off denial, that feed off ignoring it. And the contrary is also true, that they die in the face of light. It's like all those maggots, all parasites that cannot handle light. They thrive in darkness, they thrive in silence, they thrive in lies and in cover-ups. So light happens to be the healthy force. But it has to be done with great sensitivity. You don't expose someone who's been living in the dark all their lives suddenly to bright light, because it will blind them, it will scare them, frighten them. It could even be dangerous. It has to be done subtly and gently, and in a way that a person can acclimate themselves to a new way of looking at things. It's like seeing a new world. So here you have a chapter in the Torah that addresses this darkest corner of our lives in a very blunt and direct way. So it's true, it's packaged in the biblical story of Moses and Pharaoh and the throes of Egypt. But it's really the story of darkness. And as I said earlier, the story of our own inner Mitzrayims and all the fears that are accompany entering into such a difficult place. So we'll begin with the Zohar, the classical mystical work authored by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, written down by his student Rab Abba. This is basically the Talmudic times. And it's the Zohar structure around the chapters of the Torah, so it's like the mystical, the esoteric interpretation and spiritual interpretation of the verses in each chapter. So the Zohar in this chapter, the opening of the chapter, asks the following question. It says, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. Remember, we're now in the middle of the depths of Egypt, the plagues. The Egyptians have been oppressing the Jews now for close to 200 years. And God says to Moses, Boy el Pare, literally means come to Pharaoh. And then he continues, because I have hardened his heart, and I'm coming to tell you to go and challenge him. So the Zohar focuses on the word boy, the name of the chapter boy, and asks, in Aramaic is the way the Zohar is written, like the Talmud, why does it say boy al pare? It should have said lech al pare. In other verses you find it says that God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh, which seems more grammatically correct. Go to Pharaoh. What does it mean to come to Pharaoh? Come refers to if you're in a place, you invite somebody to come to you. But if you're not there, you tell them to go there. So the word in Hebrew would be lech, like lech lecha, alech. Moses was clearly not by Pharaoh, because then he wouldn't have to be told to go there. So what does it mean to come to Pharaoh? And the Zohar continues and answers, because Moses was terrified. As the Zohar puts it, he was terrified to enter into the domain and the realm of what the Zohar defines as being Pharaoh, as the great serpent, called the Tanin Hagadol, the great serpent, which of course means in a spiritual sense the great force, negative force called Pharaoh. And he was terrified. He was afraid. So therefore God said to him, don't go, but come with me. I'm coming with you. Or you're coming with me. So go would imply I'm here and I send you there. Come to Pharaoh implies you're coming with me, I go along with you. And when Moses heard that, he was able to enter. Now of course the question is, why suddenly this comes up now? This is not the first time Moses is going to see Pharaoh. He's already seen Pharaoh several times. In the last chapter, Shmois, I don't know how many times, but at least 3-4 times that he saw Pharaoh, every plague. So what suddenly happened here that he was so afraid? So the commentaries of Zohar and other mystical works explain, if Pharaoh represents the psychological depths of darkness, the ugliest parts of our lives that each of us carries in our soul. But there are very many dimensions to this dark place. And Moses confronting and challenging Pharaoh till now were the outer dimensions. And now that 7 of the 10 plagues have attacked and have so-called weakened Pharaoh's armor, now we're talking about entering into a deeper dimension. And that's where Moses suddenly got scared. Because till now he was still dealing with forces he had the power. Moses was himself a powerful figure. But now he was already going into the places of darkness that he was not at all comfortable with, and have preferred to stay away from, not to be overcome by it. So that's why suddenly here Moses is scared and frightened. And here's where God responds, so come with me, because now at this point I will go with you. We'll go together and you'll have the strength to overcome it all. And of course, the rest is history. As Moses succumbed to his fears, we wouldn't be here to talk about this. And there would never have been an exodus from Egypt. Because Pharaoh wasn't exactly ready to release the Jews from there. But Moses goes, because he goes with this encouragement, with this strength, which we shall discuss. And he enters into that darkest place. And he comes out prevailing. That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And ultimately prevails that Pharaoh expels the Jews, and the rest of the story is the story of the redemption later in this same chapter. As I said, the rest is history. So let's analyze this for a moment, what this means, especially in our personal terms. Why didn't just God say to Moses, listen, you're afraid, okay, I understand, I have compassion for you, I'll go, I'll take care of him. He insists that Moses go with him. If God's going already, what does he need Moses for? It's one thing if God isn't going. So he's sending Moses, he's the messenger. And more importantly, what does it mean, as I said, in the most personal sense of the word? Well, there's a story they tell that it happened in 1927. It's in Stalinist Russia. Stalin's Russia. Which, as we all know, was more or less almost like a hell of his counterpart in Germany. And particularly in the early 20s, when the communists came to power, the Bolsheviks first. So Jews, have always been the target for some reason. And one of the things the communists did was prohibit all Jewish activity. So you're talking about a country that some say had over 10 million Jews. No one really knows the numbers. They didn't take census at that time, especially in that country. But there were many, many Jews. So imagine suddenly, God forbid, prohibition against synagogues, against kosher food, against every aspect of Jewish life. So it wasn't a small matter. There were big debates among Jewish leaders in Russia what to do. So the pogroms earlier, in the earlier part of the century, like in 1905, 1906, was actually the cause of the first great immigration of Jews to this country here. Many Jews here come from grandparents that arrived on these shores in the early part of the 20th century. The second immigration was later, after World War II. But nevertheless, there was still, most of the Jews still remained in Eastern Europe and in Russia, Soviet Union. So it was a big, big dilemma, and a serious one. It was the future of the Jewish life. So there was, as I said, some said, listen, let's get out of this place. Others said, how could we just leave? There's so many of us here. If all the rabbis and the leaders leave, what are you going to do with the rest of the Jews? Not everybody can just run. And it was not easy times. It's not like there was money flowing around. There was no real help. And there was some beginning of humanitarian efforts happening in the United States, but it was all very small, relatively speaking. So there was one great Rebbe who actually, his yahrzeit is this coming week, 60 years ago, passed away. And he, in his own way, took upon himself the responsibility to challenge. But he did it in a very strategic manner. He called in 9 colleagues of his. And this is a secret meeting that till this day we don't know all the details. But what we do know is that they took upon themselves a pact, a vow. To the last drop of blood, they would do whatever it takes to keep Jewish life alive in the Soviet Union. This would entail, of course, great danger to themselves and their families. But what they did was, with the whole plan, was to create networks, secret networks, of underground synagogues and mikvahs, and any other way, teaching children, circumcising children, doing whatever possible, city by city, to keep Jewish life, at least some flame alive. Because it would just be a matter of time where it would be almost impossible if that didn't exist. Now, of course, some said, how much can you really accomplish? What are you going to do? It's just a handful of people. But this Rebbe knew the power of quality over quantity. It wasn't about numbers. It was about just keeping as much as possible alive, some type of effort. Now, of course, most of these people were killed, arrested and killed, which is a story of its own. And this Rebbe himself, of course, was arrested and almost killed. And because they found out about his plan. Plan continued even after he was arrested. Now, just to tell you, just a footnote, it's not a footnote, when Putin became president of Russia. So for all the critique you may have about him, when it came to the Jews, he's been very kind to them. He actually insists, wherever there is any type of rebuilding of a church in Russia, he insists that the synagogues also be rebuilt there. No one really knows until recently what's this root of his so-called soft spot to Jews. Now, does that mean he's a tzaddik? Probably not. But remember, his predecessors also knew Jews were powerful, and yet they didn't exactly have that soft spot. If anything, it was the opposite. So a while back I heard from the chief rabbi of Russia, told me that Putin grew up in a home, and he was a child. In his home, there was a Jewish tenant. And the children in that home, he would play with. And that was one of the secret synagogues. And mikvahs were in the basement of that home. So when President Putin was a child, he was one of the people that would hide. That when any authorities came, he would cover up the mikvah and the synagogue. This was his friends. This is what he grew up with. Just to show you a story, a little glimmer of light in an interesting country. So all this because of decisions made in 1927 would impact a person who became the president of the country. And has definitely in a positive way impacted Jewish life. I was in Moscow 1 year ago exactly, this month. And I can tell you personally, the Renaissance there is just beyond belief. Obviously people talk about fears and other things, and I'm sure there are. But you can't deny that the first time in 70, 80 years, there's a Renaissance, a true Renaissance. It's an absolute miracle to look at it, especially if you know the history. Doesn't mean it's far from perfect, but this alone is worth recognizing. But let me go back to why I'm telling the story. So in 1927, when this man was arrested, The interesting or maybe sad part of it all was that the Jewish communists were the worst anti-Semites of all. And there was a group of, a branch of communists that were called the Yevsektia. These were the Jewish communists. And they were the worst because they, whatever reason, had this hatred to religion and had this hatred to anyone like this Rebbe who was trying to fight for the survival of the Jews. And they all spoke Yiddish, of course. And more importantly, they were all Hasidim, the grandchildren of Hasidim, of this Rebbe's grandfather. So it's very interesting their conversations that they had from this hating place. At the same time, they all knew where their roots were. So many stories are told, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But the one I want to share with, which I think is critical to understand the story of Moses and fear and our own fears, is the one where he made the decision, and this has been documented because this Rebbe wrote a diary. He called it Masechta Gehenim. It means the tractate from hell, describing the hell that he went through. So he writes in one of the chapters there, he writes that he made a personal decision simply for his own sanity, to preserve his own sanity. He made a decision that he would not cooperate in any way with the authorities, wherever he can, wherever possible. Which can sound like crazy. Why not save your life? But it was for his own morale, his own spiritual integrity. And one of the decisions he made was he's not going to speak Russian. Though he was fluent in Russian, he spoke Yiddish. And they spoke Yiddish to him because they knew Yiddish. This was one of his ways of, I guess, as I said, preserving some form of dignity. And so there was once an interrogation which was never peaceful, it was very painful, they would torture and all that. And one of the guards came over to him and said to him, in Yiddish, he said, Rebbe. He called him Rebbe. He said to him, do you know where you are? So the Rebbe, without flinching, said, yes, I know where I am, in a place that is pater from a mezuzah. That's what he told him. A place where it does not need to have a mezuzah. Places that don't have to have a mezuzah are either a stable or a bathroom. That's how he responded to it. But then he said, no, you understand where you are. You are here under our control. And this place you cooperate. In Yiddish, mind you. And then he pointed a gun to his head. A pistol, a loaded pistol, and said to him, Rebbe, this little thing here, this little revolver, has made many people cooperate. And the Rebbe looked at him and said to him, this little toy can frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. That's what he said to him. And the guy put down the gun and said to him, okay, we'll see who will prevail. And the Rebbe responded, yes, we shall see. Now you have to remember the circumstances are not exactly, this is not a movie with a happy ending at the end. They could have shot him in a moment. There was no such thing as a due process. There was no such thing as justice. People were shot like flies for no reason. And not only did he get out, he got out from Russia. He ended up getting out from Nazis as well and ended up coming to the United States in 1940. Now you could say it's a miracle. Yes, it definitely is in some way. No one really understands how he was able to make it. But what did he mean by that? And who actually did prevail? When you hear the story of Putin, I don't know where the grandchildren of those Yevsektia Jews are today. But we know where the grandchildren are of this Rebbe and his Chassidim. So who did prevail? Now that it's, 1927? We're talking about 83 years later? More? 93 years later? I don't even know where we are. Where are we? 2010. Okay. Figure it out. Almost 100 years later, let's put it this way. But the story of the fear of this toy, the line that he said, one God, many worlds, one world and many gods, is unbelievable if you think about it. It's not like he was embracing death and was not afraid to die. Of course, every one of us has this instinct to want to live. And especially if you're a Rebbe and you're a person who follows the Torah, it says, V'chai b'hem. You shall live by the Torah, not to die by it. No, so living is considered to be sacred. But that doesn't mean that someone can frighten him. Why? Because why really was a person afraid of death? So you have many mystical systems, especially in Far Eastern thought, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Philip, there's a book in it, right? Anyway, but in some of the Far Eastern thinking, they actually say that the root of all fear is the fear of death. And that's why we have to eliminate that fear by understanding that the soul always is alive, or however they understand it, or how you embrace or train a person to stop fearing death. But why is death why are we so afraid of death? I mean, it may sound like a foolish question. Why wouldn't we be afraid? No, but really, what psychologically? Because for death means for most of us, or maybe for all of us, the end. And we fear ends. We don't want to end. Not you, not I. Who wants to end? Finality. It's over. But is it truly over? That's the question. And again, I reiterate as a disclaimer, this doesn't mean that a person who lives by the soul and knows that we live on wants to die, God forbid, or embraces it, or looks forward. It's not just the case. Because there's much blessing and much greatness that is achieved in this life on this earth. But to call this the end, or finality, is essentially giving the power of materialism over spirituality. It would basically be saying that beginnings and end are defined by our myopic vision of what life is about. So though emotionally we may not relate, but intellectually at least we can understand. As I often give I don't call it humorous, I don't like to use the word humorous, but it's somewhat of I guess another take. When people ask the question, everyone asks this question, where does the soul go to after we die? It's a big question. Where does the soul go to? We all want to know where the soul goes to. So my response is always the same way, and that is that the question itself is based on a very false, and you could even say arrogant, premise. And just to use a figurative, imaginative dialogue between an appliance and electricity. So think of this refrigerator communicating with electricity, okay? And the refrigerator says to the electricity, where do you go to when they pull the plug? And the electricity responds to the refrigerator, what do you mean where I go to? What kind of chutzpah is that? Where'd you come from? You think you know where you think you're where it's at, and I go somewhere? I've been around since the beginning of time, unencumbered, unfettered, and untrapped by any box. They just invented the refrigerator, as a little box in the last century or two. They figured out how to tap and generate electricity and bottle it up inside of the box. And now you think you are it. You're just one little box. I go back to where I always was before I entered and was confined by you, the box. So if a soul were to speak to a body, that's exactly what would be the conversation. In our view, in our self-aggrandizing view of how we see ourselves, is we think this is where it's at. I'm where it's at. And anything else is some novelty or some exotic experience. When in truth, there are realities that are far beyond us, and we are no different than a refrigerator, meaning a box, a body, where it confines the soul's energy for a little period of time. And the soul was here before it entered this box, and will continue after it leaves this box. This doesn't mean that death is a blessing, and it doesn't mean we should look forward to it, God forbid, and it doesn't mean that it makes it easier, but at least we should not deceive ourselves to think that we have it all figured out. We can say, yes, I'm trapped in my little box, and this is how I see things. And that's where it's painful. Yes, it's true. The soul can see us. We can't see it. That's a very painful thing. That's why we sit shiva, God forbid, when we lose a parent or a close relative. And that's why it is a tragedy. Not dismissing. The tragedy, however, is not that things end. The tragedy is that the body and soul can no longer speak to each other. That there's a wall that goes up between these two worlds. So when the Rebbe said to him, he said to him, this toy can frighten someone that has one world and many gods. Yeah, when you have one world and you take it away, there's nothing left. But if you have one God and many worlds, there are many dimensions. But that doesn't come, that strength and courage doesn't come on its own. So let's go back to the story of Moses here. God did not go himself to Pharaoh because that's not the purpose of existence. The purpose of existence is that we, fragile, mortal, and yes, sometimes fearful human beings, enter into a world that has a lot of fear and a lot of reasons to be afraid. And we learn to become courageous souls that bring light into this world. Not only don't we get hurt by others, but we actually can prevail and transform the universe that we live in. Do we need strength? Absolutely. So when Moses comes to meet the heart of the great reptile, Tanin HaGadol, he's terrified. But he was terrified not in an unhealthy way. It's healthy to be afraid of such a force of darkness. And he elicits from God the response, I will come with you. We'll go together. You don't go alone. You don't march alone in this world. And when do you need God more than any other time is when you meet darkness. When we're in light, we can deceive ourselves that we can make it on our own. So Moses' fright and fear actually elicits this power, gives him the strength, and he enters and changes history, basically. I remember here at this class 10 years ago, there was a group. After the class, two people came over to me, and one woman introduced me to her friend, who, as we stood closer, I saw that she had gone through some trauma in her life. As you'll see in a moment. From a distance, it was hard to see. And she shares with me her story. She was standing right at the end of the class here, so I remember it very vividly. It wasn't in this room here. It was when we were still up Upper West Side. And she says that she was one of the first victims of the terrorist attacks in Jerusalem. I shouldn't even mention it anymore, but there was a time when there were quite a few. But this was like one of the early ones. If you may remember, it was very chilling because it was like one of the big ones in Ben Yehuda, in Jerusalem, in the area, in the center. There was a Friday afternoon where a lot of Jews come out to shop and to spend time. And so this woman, she was an American woman, she's telling me, she went to study in yeshiva there. And Friday, she went to a cafe to meet a friend. And it was in that cafe where a bomb was left. And quite a few casualties, fatalities. And she was sitting at a table, and it also affected her. It didn't kill her. But basically, the way she put it, I don't want to even repeat it the way she said it, I'll mild it a bit. She said, it essentially destroyed my face. And my hearing, I cannot hear now on both ears. One ear, I think, was a total loss. No smell, no taste. And they had to rebuild me, basically. And I was lying in that hospital. So she shared even this, I forgot to mention this point. She said, I was American. My parents would not hear of me going to Israel. So I never told them I'm going to Israel. I told them I'm going to travel to Europe and Asia, which includes Israel. But they didn't see it that way. And they first saw that I was in Israel when they saw pictures on CNN of me covered in blood. Obviously, they overlooked that issue. They came flying to be supported on her side. But then she said, I was lying in this hospital, literally fighting for my life, and I was so angry, because here I came to Israel just for one reason, to explore my Judaism. And what happens is, I'm sitting there Friday, I was so angry at God, why not take my life? What do you leave me here like basically a vegetable, a ragged doll, as she put it. And for months she was lying there fighting, and they had to do plastic surgery and all kinds of stuff, and she was not even agreeing to all that procedures because she didn't even want to live. And finally, one day she says, I woke up one morning, and I don't know where it came from, but I had a surge of strength that went through me, that seeped through me, and I made a decision right there, I'm going to live, and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to rebuild my life. And then she said this line that can only come from the sincerity of a person who's been there, that I'll never forget. She said to me, and I discovered the power of faith. You can only appreciate faith, this is her words, when you have nothing else left but that. Now, I, thank God, I've never been in that type of situation, so I cannot speak that way. But I have seen people that have been. And this includes Holocaust survivors, and includes this woman. Now, none of us should ever have to go to such a dark place where there's nothing left but that. However, it can teach us the power of faith, even when you don't have to go that dark. And it is an unbelievable force in our lives that can be accessed, as I said, even if you're not in the darkest of places. When Moses was afraid to go to Pharaoh, it wasn't a fear that Moses was a great man. He had already approached Pharaoh. He knew some things about life. His fear was the natural reaction, but he knew very well what he was trying to elicit. He wanted God to go with him. That's exactly what he was doing. It wasn't manipulative. It was natural. But it wasn't like he was running the other direction either. You know, people are afraid they don't show up altogether. Here he showed his fright to God, and God said, I come with me. So clearly he was not retreating. He was just being himself and saying, I can't do this alone. It's a big difference than someone who just runs. So when we have our fears, to go back to the beginning of this discussion, and many of them are very legitimate, and many of them, as I said, are absolutely invisible, because they were born and they were nurtured, or I could say nourished better, in a time before we even remember. The deepest fears people have come from very early part of our lives. So someone who's been brought up in a healthy home and was nurtured and validated and continuously watered, so to speak. So that person builds confidence to take on any challenge. That's where real courage comes from. So every one of us is born with natural courage because the soul has power. What happens is that when it's not watered, a garden that's not watered, even though it has potential to grow, but the weeds begin to gather, and the weeds are the weeds of fear. And when fear begins to gather, what happens is the natural courage of the soul gets submerged, buried. Doesn't disappear, it always remains there. Which is why you'll find even people who have a lot of fears, suddenly there can be spurts of courage suddenly out of nowhere. Where did it come from? Because it's there. But it's become so dormant that it's basically inactive and almost invisible. And what happens now is fear has taken over. As I said, the worst fear of all is the one that hides. You can't even tell it's fear. It can take on the shape of being actually a very fun-loving person. And you're always there at parties and everything, but comes to commitment, you're not going to be there for too long. You can usually see fear when it comes to maintenance, maintaining a relationship, being there when it gets difficult, when it's not in your terms. Anger, some attribute to fear. Why is it some people, you say the wrong word to them, they explode, and others, you could say the same wrong word to them and they don't? And not because the latter person is not sensitive or does not hear what you said. Because insecure people don't have control over their feelings. A secure person has much more resilience. As I said, many worlds. So someone may insult you, but you have another world to turn to that gives you strength. If all your eggs are in one basket, obviously if someone takes that away, it's going to create a lot of turmoil in your life. So as they say in the financial world, even though that's not a word to be quoted these days, diversify, diversify, diversify. You can take that into diversify your investments, meaning where you invest your energy. If it's all invested in money, yes, when money will be lost, then your value, which is defined by that, will be affected. But if your investments are also in things you love, and people you love, and you have family, and you have other many worlds, as I said, many baskets. So it's true, you lose one, or one is somewhat compromised. Not that it's pleasant, but you have others to turn to. You have other pillars that hold you up. That's called having backup, so to speak. So in the context of Moses and the lessons, fear we all have in our lives. There's plenty of things to be afraid of. But you have to know that you have inherent courage in your soul that's always there. And what's required sometimes to elicit it is that faith that I was describing. To know you're not traveling alone. So that's what Moses wanted to find out. I'm not traveling alone. I'm not traveling alone. I'm not going alone. I'm coming. You're coming with me, or I'm coming with you. It's another story. That allowed his inner courage to emerge. So it wasn't just riding on God's promise. It was also his own self, his own soul, but you're not going alone. Think of it as a good friend. When we have good friends that we can turn to, truly turn to in times of need, that we can trust, that you know will withstand. They're not just there with you in good weather. They're not just there when it's easy. These people, not only can you depend on them, there's something deeper. They happen to elicit from you the courage that you have inside yourself. That's even greater. Because it's not just leaning on them. So the question is, do we have such friends? And of course, as I said earlier, sometimes insecure people like insecure friends. It makes you feel not so bad about yourself. You say, that person is more insecure than I am, type of thing. Sometimes people who have confidence intimidate those that don't have so much confidence. Sometimes we see confidence, if we don't have it ourselves, as being arrogant. Or as like someone being elitist, or thinks who they think they are. So, in a way, God works. Sometimes it's God that comes with you. Sometimes God works through certain friends we have in our lives. People who have that strength. I've studied this, I can't say scientifically, but when you want to look for something, you look for it. I've seen people in my life, the people that I've seen that had the courage to withstand were always those people that had some type of inner core that they could always turn to no matter what happens. I'll give you an example from my own life. I had my father who was like that. My father was a very interesting personality. As much as he was engaged in life, he was a journalist and he was a conversationalist, very sociable person, very easygoing in that sense. But there was always a part of him that was never really there. Not even with us, not even with his own family. And I saw him many times sitting at a table, and anything could be going on, biggest chaos, whatever. But he had this inner peace. He just sat there. You'd think he's half asleep, but I know that he was like in the strongest place possible, like the eye of a tornado in a way. And he's a man that was born in the Soviet, under Stalinist Russia. And to tell you something else, just to tie it up, his father was one of those 10 people I mentioned that gave their life for Jewish perpetuation in Russia. He ended up coming out of there. He was in Siberia, tortured for many years. I never met him, but I carry his name. So it's my grandfather that was one of those 10 that took that vow. So that's the climate my father grew up in. So he was under the fire. It wasn't in the Holocaust per se in Nazi Germany. It was in the Holocaust of Stalin's Russia. And I have no doubt that that was a part of how he survived. He lost his parents at a younger age. He had to bring up his his two brothers, younger brothers. But I learned a lot from that, and I learned from it more today than even at the time, because he never spoke about it. I would try to dig. No way I can get there. And it wasn't because it was painful, because it was just quiet. It was this quiet place of strength. And I've since seen it in others. And more importantly, I've seen it in almost everybody I've ever met, but some of us have access to it and some don't. That's the challenge. But those that have access to it are the people that are unshakable. It doesn't mean you can't upset them. It doesn't mean they don't get frustrated. It doesn't mean they're not human. But there's something that is unshakable. There are people like that in this world, believe it or not. And more importantly, each of you has that possibility, believe it or not, as well, as hard as it is to believe. I remember telling this to somebody. I said, I see such unbelievable strength in you. And that guy started laughing. He says, you got the wrong guy, Rabbi, not me. I shake under, and anything shakes me. It's true, because there's a part of us, as I said, that has succumbed and has become a victim to our own enemies, our own internal enemies, which is the fears we carry. And we have not learned the tools how to access that other voice. But it's there. So how do you access it? Well, it's easy to just say faith, and just have faith and it'll be great. But faith has to be cultivated. Faith doesn't just come because you decide you're going to have a little faith tomorrow. Because if you're a person that is driven by fears, Guaranteed, next thing that scares you, you're not going to just be able to say, oh, where's my faith thing? The faith will disappear as fast as it came. It's critical to feed it, and to feed it requires a steady diet. Steady diet of, number one, being with people, even a person, that have some of it themselves. It will help elicit it within you. The second thing is yes, actions, and even prayer, but on a constant basis. Now, I remember someone asking me, why is it that you need to pray 3 times a day and every day? It's a problem. Every time I have a problem, I'll pray. And actually, according to Torah law, the true mitzvah of prayer from the Torah is only when you have needs. Maimonides says this in the laws of prayer. He says that technically, from a purely Torah point of view, from the Daraisa, meaning from the written law, the real commandment of prayer is when you have a need. But when you don't have a particular need, there's no real mitzvah to pray. Yet, the rabbis designated prayers throughout, as I said, 3 times a day. Because true prayer, I don't mean lip service here. Everyone knows what lip service is? Philip, you ever seen any lip service in your life? Huh? Yeah. Philip's my punching bag whenever I'm in need of scapegoat. You look like a sailor. That's what I decided. Okay. Prayer, not lip service, which is Avodah Shebelev, Zohi Tefillah. Ezu Avodah Shebelev. What is the service of the heart? It's emoting with something beyond you. Remember, fear is an emotion. So how do you counter an emotion? You have to have an emotion that's as equally powerful, if not more powerful. So going back to that story of that Rebbe, if you can emote with the invisible voice inside your soul, which is connected to the invisible force called the God, you have an emotional force that can counter a fear. Now, I know that sounds good on paper. I see some of you writing it down. But it's harder to act upon because we're so accustomed to acting based on our patterns and our habits, which is why it needs a conscientious and a very deliberate effort, literally day after day, just like diet, just like exercise, that feeds this voice inside of you. So it's people in your life that have it, that can give you some of that strength. Be with them, especially in times when a person needs it. And 2, it's the diet that we feed ourselves, that we nourish that part of ourselves. So the boyal pare really means is a statement said to everyone, that God says to all of us, that when you have a fear to overcome, don't retreat. If it's an issue around commitments, let's say in relationships, or other areas where you know with your mind that you should be moving forward, but your heart doesn't let you go, you're afraid, whether it's fears you can identify, you can't identify. So there's a commandment, a specific commandment in this parsha that says, Boyal Pare, come with me to that place. So God says, I will go with you if you invite me and let me come with you. And that's where we have specific strength, because every mitzvah comes with strength. If we're told to do something or asked to do something, it means we're also getting the power to do so. And it gives us the ability to encounter or confront that particular fear, rather. Now, another interesting thing I should add is that, generally speaking, it's very hard to face your demons face to face. It's not even necessarily the right thing to do. There's a thing called the back door. You see, fears are driven not by rationale. They're driven by the rational thinking. It's driven by irrational thinking. Just like a child is afraid to open up a closet and say there's a boogie monster, there's some ghost inside the closet. So you can explain to the child all day and all long there's no ghosts, until that child, with its parent, goes and opens the door and you shine the light and once and again, and sees there's nothing to be afraid of. It's an emotional reaction. It's not rational. You can't tell somebody, I don't know what you're afraid of. There's nothing there. Because fear doesn't come from the mind. It comes from the heart. So it's in a very strong emotional force. And in that sense, sometimes you can't challenge it head on, because it controls you. It's your emotion, it's your feeling. What are you going to tell the feeling? You can explain everything, it won't help. And to go to force somebody to do something that they're terrified of, sometimes can backfire as well. So we have a thing called the back door. Back door means it's a trick that is beyond the emotions. The mind, because it's smarter than the heart, can devise strategies that can manipulate your heart. I'm talking about good manipulation here. They call it sometimes in psychology a cognitive life raft. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. But it's used in some therapies where if you can't yet emotionally see yourself in a situation, you create a life raft. It's like going into a water where you're afraid to go into the water. So you don't go into the water, but cognitively, with your mind, you can imagine a raft of yourself floating there. It's almost like imagining yourself in a situation without actually being there. It often has the power to diffuse certain fears, because if you could imagine yourself, it makes it easy. You see, it's not that terrifying. Whereas if you actually force the person to go, it wouldn't work. So the mind has its own ways to help diffuse fears. But obviously it has to go hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier, like the faith thing. One of the examples they give for that is like, it's actually a story, a Hasidic story, where this older Chassid was able to, well, the full story is like this. The two guys came to town, two smart Alex. And it was Friday afternoon, and they wanted to go to the mikveh, as the custom for some Hasidim to go to the mikveh before Shabbos. But it was a cold winter, and the cold winter, they said no one really goes to the mikveh, because the mikveh is located in a building you have to go through a certain mountain that's very slippery, and it's dangerous. They said nobody in the whole city goes. They said, yeah, there's one older chassid, he's like 85, he goes to the mikveh. They said, how does he manage? They couldn't believe it. They decided to follow him. Yeah, they follow him, and lo and behold, it's true. He, as slippery as it was, he was able to maneuver his way down to the shack. These two guys, one of them tried and broke his left leg. The other guy saw that, didn't even try. Schlepped him back to the place. And Shabbos, they meet the chassid. They said, can you explain? We're in our 20s and we couldn't make it down that slippery slope. How did you manage it? And you manage it every Friday, they tell us. So he said, very simple. He was like so nonchalant about it. He said, well, in Yiddish he says, "Wenn es zugebunden eben, fällt man nicht unten." He said, when you're tied above, you don't fall below. You know, if you feel that there's a strength, like a string, that's a rope that's holding you up from here, you don't fall below. If all your strength is coming from your agile and young legs, yeah, slippery slopes, so you're not be able to make it. So there are strengths that we can sometimes call upon that are not necessarily visible, but they can give you strength more than you have on your own. I mentioned it last week. It's not Newton that said it, but it's actually written in books, or more long before Newton, Torah books that say that we are midgets that stand on the shoulders of giants. And when you're able to elicit or able to hold on to a strength that came before you, it can give you strength that you could never have on your own. Being tied above. So if you combine that with the cognitive life raft, which means a mind that can imagine a situation, so even though emotionally you're not there, you have a good friend, you have some faith and connection to above, and you have that cognitive imagination, those three forces can begin to weaken the hold of fearful feelings, fear. But, as I said, this is work. Don't ever think it's going to be a magic trick. There's no magic pill for these things. It's work and constant work, and there'll be setbacks, but it's doable. And I've seen it happen. I've seen people who grew up in the worst situations. That's why I'm speaking not theoretically, who grew up in homes that had nothing that gave them any courage, opposite, to be afraid of everything, and they found strength in their lives. It took work. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom, but it doesn't have to take that as well. You can find different strengths, as I mentioned, from the different directions. So here you have it in a chapter, Boyal Parage, one verse, and a Zohar, and it's not a forced message. It's actually the story of the entire Exodus, because this was ultimately the power. Because if you think about it, it was God that led the Jews into Egypt, and it's God that led them out of there. So what do we have to have everything in between? You want to take them out of Egypt? Take them out of Egypt. You need 10 plagues and all kinds of hardening hearts and back and forth and back and forth. It would also be a shorter Torah if we didn't have all these chapters. God. So you have all pre-planned. But you see, if it wouldn't have happened, we would not have a blueprint for how to deal with our fears. We also go into our own Mitzrayim. We all have our own convoluted and complex lives. And there has to be a way of weakening that hold. And you can't just say, God's going to do it for you. It's not the way it works. God meets you halfway. You have to do your part. So here you have the story is really like the process. Several years ago I discussed in length the 10 plagues as they play themselves out in psychological terms. How we weaken the hold of fear in our lives through these different plagues. There are basically 10 tools. There are CDs of that in case you want to get that. But I was discussing this evening was more the general fear, without getting into the specifics, and some of the antidotes, some of the solutions. And we know the end of the story. In this same chapter, they are freed ultimately. That means that we have the power to be freed from our fears. Now, I speak here with many people in the room, so obviously there has to be certain generalities that I would rather, of course, customize case by case, but that's difficult to do sitting in one room with all of us together. So that's up to you. You have to take this, try to take these ideas, and adapt it to your particular and personal situation, and you'll find real solutions to some of our deepest fears. I would not always suggest starting with the hardest. You can start with the easier ones. It's like untangling a tangled ball of yarn. If you start untangling the hardest tangles, you usually get worse. So you start with the outer extremities, and then slowly divide and conquer. It gets easier and easier. So above all, let me say that may God bless us all, you all, and us all. That number one is that we should just have less fears, period. But should they pop up, or should they not pop up, but their symptoms pop up in the indecisiveness and lack of determination or lack of ability to make decisions in your life, there are solutions. And don't think you're alone. There are people that can be your friend, and there are people that you can reach to, and then you have ultimately your own resources. Those good friends will help you access those resources. So the worst thing possible is to isolate yourself or to feel hopeless, because that feeds fear. Fear is fed by fear. That's the bottom line. And it's weakened by strength. So God should bless us all with strength, and the biggest strength of all is to access your own strength. So thank you very much, everybody. And I will just say next Wednesday, I'm here next Wednesday again, at always 8:15. Philip will be here tomorrow at 7 p.m., his weekly class. Oh, Philip, take a bow. This is Philip. Yeah. Well, you'll never know, Philip. I used to also think it would be fewer people. Things tend to grow on you. And I thank you, everyone. It's always a great honor and pleasure to sit here with all you courageous souls who made it out here and braved the way. Thank you. Thank you.